All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and it's Friday. We're going to be talking about the best decks to play right now in Pokemon Pocket, the best meta decks for any competitive play, whether that is, for tournaments or, for your emblem events, really anything. I think that the metagame kind of translates to really all of the different game modes. But before we get into the decks today, we got to let you guys know that the Pokemon's Pocket Tournament number 8 is tomorrow. This is the largest weekly tournament series, and I would definitely recommend that you guys go and play. It's going to be streamed and casted on Saturday and on Sunday. It's going to be a whole lot of fun, so definitely go and register. Link down in the description below. Also in the comments, normally I put the link to the tournament page. So, and also stay tuned for the live streams Saturday and Sunday. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. Anyway, let's get right into the deck lists here. This is probably going to be a quicker video this week. In fact, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Not only am I going to be showing like the top 8 decks, but I'm going to be breaking them down in terms of why I believe they're positioned well, for the current metagame. And we're going into the 3rd week, so things are definitely changing a lot, but there's a lot of, things that I'm noticing in terms of the meta development. And I think that right now, it's very, very apparent which decks are kind of taking over the metagame and really solidifying themselves as like top contenders. And again, that might change as we go into like the 4th week or the 5th week, because this is going to be an extended season. But you're going to want to stay updated, because by the end of the month, when ranked battles come out, you're going to want to be, have a good understanding of what is good at this moment, because things have already changed so much over the last like 2.5, 3 weeks since B1 was released, since Mega Rising came out. Okay, let's get right into it. So the first deck is going to be Blaziken and Heatmor. So this is kind of like the new top deck. This popped up definitely, I would say, about a week or so ago, and then has gotten really popular over this week. To me, this is kind of like the top dog right now. The decks in this video are kind of in order, kind of not. I would say that the first 4 decks we're going to take a look at today are all like the strongest decks, and then after that, things get a little bit different in terms of my reasoning for why you should be playing them. But anyway, Blaziken Heatmor is sort of the final form of Blaziken. I think that it's the best way to play it. It took people a little bit of time to figure out how to play Mega Blaziken, but everybody knew that this card was really strong. As it turns out, just playing this with Heatmor and Cyrus really is kind of the top way to playing it. The example that we have up on here on screen is just a high placement Mega Blaziken Heatmor deck from a recent online tournament. I think there's a lot of ways that you can play the deck. I think that at least one Cyrus is definitely needed with Heatmor. You could play 2. I like Rocky Helmet as well to kind of pressure on the active, because Heatmor can only hit the bench. And then Copycat and May are both really good consistency cards alongside Professor's Research. So you could play 2 Copycat instead of 1 Copycat May. You could cut a Guzma in place of like a second Cyrus, but I think for the most part, only 1 Flame Patch is needed for the deck, and at least 1 Rocky Helmet makes a lot of sense here as well. I like the 1 Combuskin. Chingling is still very common in the metagame, so that's sort of the thing, and I think that's why we're playing the Rocky Helmet. Chingling is really the only thing that's stopping this deck from just steamrolling every deck in the entire game. If I take a look at the matchup spreads for Mega Blaziken and Heatmor over the last like week or so, it has like a 50-50 win rate, actually above 50% win rate, like a 53% win rate against Absol Oricorio. It has a 56% win rate against Hydreigon. It has a 62% win rate against Suicune Greninja, has a 55% win rate against Magnezone, a 50% win rate against Decidueye, and a 42% win rate against Mega Altaria and Indeedee. So that's kind of the one thing here that is stopping Mega Blaziken from really steamrolling this metagame right now, and I think it's kind of its matchup into Altaria. I think that Mega Altaria is really the only thing that can stand toe-to-toe with Mega Blaziken and put enough pressure on the bench with Jirachi, or heal the active enough with Indeedee, or of course, item lock with Chingling, right? So Altaria seems to be the number 1 deck in terms of positioning to deal with Mega Blaziken, and spoiler, it's the next deck probably I think that we're going to talk about here, but I think that in general, we're definitely seeing sort of a toe-to-toe, top dog kind of battle at the top of the metagame between Mega Blaziken, Heatmor, and Altaria. We'll talk more about Altaria after this, because I think there's a lot of ways to play it. But those matchup spreads should definitely stand out to you. Blaziken also, in a small sample size, has struggled against Mega Ampharos, so I guess that could be like a potential for Mega Ampharos to kind of slide in there. But in general, this is a deck that is beating all of the other most played decks in the metagame right now, and against really every commonly played Oricorio variant, this matchup has been really, really good for Mega Blaziken. So I think that we were kind of figuring out the best way to play Blaziken while also working around Oricorio. And this is sort of the final list that people have settled on. Again, I really do think that Mega Blaziken has the potential to not only be the most played deck this weekend, but potentially just the winner. If I had to pick a deck to win, this might be at the top of my list just because I think a lot of people are going to play it. And if it doesn't get kind of, countered by Altaria decks in Top Cut, if the variance is proper and the matchups are proper amongst the Blaziken players in Day 2, it definitely has the potential to just win the tournament. So I had to mention this deck because it really is, like, no pun intended, the hottest deck right now in Pokemon Pocket. So keep that in mind. You know, the list can change around a little bit. You might see 2 Cyrus lists. You might see, you know, no Lily. There's a couple of different ways that we can build decks for sure. This deck is really only playing what is the 7 Pokemon. So there's a lot of other space in the deck. And it's a lot more consistent than you might think. Hold on, I'm going to take a drink of water. So the inherent downside to Blaziken, just like really any rare candy deck, is that you have to play rare candy to evolve, right? So there are going to be some games with Mega Blaziken where you just don't do anything because you just can't find rare candy or your evolution Pokemon. And that, of course, is tough. And even in Chingling matchups, like, you know, they force you to not be able to rare candy. And that's why we have Combusken. I think that the 1 copy of May is correct for that particular matchup. But the strength of Mega Blaziken is really what stands out to me, and I think that it kind of evens out the inconsistencies of playing rare candy. A lot of the other top decks in the game are also playing rare candy, whether that's Suicune or Hydreigon. It's still a strong enough card, even with Chingling in the metagame. A lot of the strongest Pokemon in the game are Stage 2 Pokemon, so they play rare candy. But yeah, Mega Blaziken, really, really well positioned. There's just really not many decks that can stand toe-to-toe with this deck list. Altaria really is sort of the only other option. And speaking of, well, I guess it's not up next, but okay, I thought Altaria was next. But next up is Suicune and Greninja. So Suicune and Greninja is probably the other top deck. However, it has been kind of knocked down a peg pretty significantly by, you know, Heatmor Blaziken, which actually has a really, really high win rate, which I think makes sense just because, you know, you can kind of, you know, have a bench pressure Pokemon a lot earlier than Suicune can. So you're just a little bit ahead of the curve. And Mega Blaziken just has so much HP that especially with 1 Lily, you can tank like up to 2 to 3 hits from things like Greninja or Suicune, even with weakness, which is crazy, right? So that HP amount for Mega Blaziken is a really, really big deal. And it's just a similar deck. Like, it's kind of crazy when you take a look at all of the top decks in the metagame right now, or 3 of them at least. You know, they're all like bench damage decks, right? Altaria has Jirachi, you know, Suicune has Greninja, and Blaziken has Heatmor. And then you pair them with Cyrus. And when we saw that the last couple of seasons, these are just sort of the strongest types of strategies in the game. We don't have any protection from, you know, getting your bench Pokemon damaged and then brought up with Cyrus. And of course, that's a very, very valuable, you know, strategy when it comes to winning games. So no surprise that some of the top decks are all employing that same strategy. Now, I think that Suicune Greninja has been buffed, right? We have May now. We have Greninja EX. We saw this deck be extremely dominant in like the second week of the metagame, but definitely got knocked down a peg. I was a little bit afraid of this deck just because I thought that, of course, it might run away with the metagame just like it did the last few seasons, but that's definitely not the case. There's plenty of things in the meta right now that are still strong into this particular list. As we saw, Heatmor and Blaziken here really, really strong into it. And then Decidueye is another deck that does really well into Suicune Greninja still. Also, Magnezone Oricorio with 1 Chingling in that deck list, also doing well into Suicune Greninja. So there's really like 3 really relevant decks in the metagame that all have winning matchups into Suicune Greninja, but what's crazy is against basically everything else in the metagame, Suicune Greninja has a really, really high win rate, and it does really well into Altaria, so that's something that's a little bit scary, is that, you know, Altaria is getting beat by Suicune is getting beat by Blaziken, which you would think it's kind of backwards, but it is what it is. Altaria seemingly is good into Blaziken for whatever the reason, and then Suicune Greninja isn't. It's just a weird sort of interaction. This is a little bit more of a volatile deck list in terms of its matchup spreads, but still a very, very strong deck. I would not be surprised to see Suicune Greninja win, you know, our tournament this weekend, just because it's still a really, really strong deck. More of a mid to late game deck than some of the other decks in the metagame are. Suicune right now feels less and less like a powerful attacker than it was in previous seasons. And again, I think it really just comes down to the high HP amount of these mega Pokemon and the healing options that are available, right? Blaziken's playing Lily, Altaria with 190 HP is playing Indeedee, and the way that the math works out, Suicune there really doesn't deal that much damage. At the most, it does like 120, but on average, it's probably doing about 80 damage, so it kind of relies on the Greninjas. But, you know, Chingling still exists to stop you from rare candying into Greninja. And then, of course, like, you know, the bench pressure that, you know, Jirachi can deal and then Heatmor can deal, that they can kind of just bring up Greninja and KO it early in the game anyway. So it really kind of limits the ability for Suicune to be that strong in the mid to late game. But this is still a top deck. I have it second here in the video, but it could be maybe the 3rd strongest deck. Maybe it's not even top 5. Who knows? We'll really see how decks perform this weekend, because I think that the results this weekend are really going to, you know, change our perspectives on what the best decks are, because I think that, you know, there's definitely a lot of strong contenders, but there's definitely a lot of decks that not many people play that can definitely go ahead and just win the tournament really, really easily. So Yeah, I had to mention Suicune Greninja. It has a very, very good win rate, about a 53%. We're seeing around 53% average win rate for all of the top decks right now. Blaziken Heatmor is sitting around 53% total average. Suicune Greninja is 53%. Altaria is also 53%. So these are like the top decks in the game right now in my mind. Suicune Greninja definitely fits the bill. Some people have been asking me, is it still worth it to play Giratina? I also didn't really know the answer to that. I'm just going off of the results, right? Because to me, there's a bunch of different like small variants of Suicune and Greninja. Some people are playing, double Greninja EX and no Giratina, but when I take a look at all of the highest placing versions of Suicune Greninja in recent tournaments over the last week, they're all playing Giratina EX. So to me, maybe we just keep playing it, and I don't know. So it's hard to say. You can kind of get fooled a little bit by like the overall win rates on Limitless for like the entire metagame, but if you take a look at the results over the last week of tournaments, all of the Suicune Greninja decks that aren't playing Giratina actually struggle a lot. So I still think Giratina EX is a very, very strong card. And going first is going to be a very valuable option to this deck list. So again, this is just one example of a Suicune Greninja deck that placed really well recently at a large tournament, and I still think it is a top deck in the metagame. Next up is Altaria. This is the version that like everyone's been playing. I think that there's, again, so many different ways we can play Altaria. It's hard to really nail down like what the best 60 card list or 20 card list is. But I do think Chingling is still important. So I definitely, moved off of Chingling a little bit, going into that second week. But as we go into the third week, I think Chingling has kind of, rose back up as a very valuable option. Like I said, many decks at the top of the meta are playing rare candy. Blaziken, Suicune Greninja, Hydreigon, Decidueye. I guess there's probably more as well, but those are the big ones. So I still think Chingling is worth playing. And again, we can play a list like this, which is sort of a balanced version of Mega Altaria, which is playing 2 Chingling, of course, as our, most valuable kind of leadoff option, 1 Jirachi, 1 Sableye, 1 Indeedee. So it's just a little bit of everything going on here, and it's kind of enough for us to kind of have whatever Pokemon we want in any given scenario. 1 Lyssia to find our Chinglings and our Jirachis and our Swablues. Because we're playing 5 Pokemon with 50 or less HP, I think 1 Lyssia is correct. And then our Pokeballs can search out Sableye and Indeedee. And this is a really valuable strategy because if you have Lyssia and Pokeball in your hand, you can play Lyssia first and then play Pokeball next after Lyssia to more, consistently guarantee that we're going to get our Sableye or Indeedee off the Pokeball. So it's definitely a very, very consistent deck. Chingling's still very, very good. Like I said, Jirachi can do all of the same things here that Blaziken, Heatmor, Suicune, and Greninja can. Double Cyrus in the deck as well. Copycat, Red, and Red and Rocky Helmet is a big standout to me. So one thing that we're definitely seeing with Mega Altaria is that 130 damage is a little bit low. There are still enough Pokemon in the game that we would like to be able to 1-hit KO, like that we kind of sometimes can't, right, with the 130 damage with Mega Altaria, right? Like a full HP Hydreigon we can't KO, Suicune we can't KO. There's definitely some examples, even like a Caped Greninja, right? So I think that the Rocky Helmet and the Red are valuable inclusions with Altaria. This is sort of my favorite list here to play it. And yeah, I think that Mega Altaria, like I said, if we take a look at its matchups, is a little bit more volatile than you might think. It is struggling a little bit against Absol or Oricorio, and it struggles against Suicune, but does really well into kind of mostly everything else. Like especially, the Blaziken Heatmor matchup, it's definitely doing pretty well in. Does really good into Decidueye, does well actually into Hydreigon as well. So I really like Mega Altaria. Again, a 53% win rate deck. It's probably the most consistent deck at the top of the meta right now. Again, it's not playing rare candies, playing only basic Pokemon other than Mega Altaria and Lyssia. Like, it's just very consistent, And when you're playing Chingling, you can access things like Copycat and Mars really well. Chingling is perhaps kind of the new Oricorio. Like, if you take a look at the metagame right now, which is kind of scaring me, or did scare me a little bit, is the absence of Oricorio in really any top meta deck. I know some people argued to me, like, oh, Absol Oricorio, like, when we did our tier list, they were saying Absol Oricorio should have been S tier, and that it should be considered a top deck. But to be fair, if you look at the win rates over the past week for the Mega Absol and Oricorio deck, they have been absolutely detrimental. They've been very, very poor. The average win rate for that deck has absolutely plummeted, and I think it's just because the metagame has really shifted around it, and the Heatmor deck and various other things that the metagame do well into that matchup. So I still like Absol. I just like it in other decks, and I think that the Hydreigon deck has kind of taken the place of that like 4th top deck of the metagame. But All that being said, I think that Chingling has kind of replaced Oricorio in a weird way. So while I was a little bit afraid that Oricorio was becoming less and less prevalent in the metagame, I think that Chingling is sort of the new staple control card. And I think it kind of does it does a very similar thing where it slows down those really strong Stage 2 EX Pokemon that Oricorio loved to be able to deal with. Chingling is just sort of our answer to that, and it's a little bit less of a high impact card in your deck. You can kind of just throw it in because it doesn't have any attack cost. It's a baby Pokemon. So shout out to Chingling. There is definitely still Oricorio in the metagame right now. We're going to talk about Oricorio later in this video, but in terms of all of the top meta decks, I don't really consider Oricorio to be in any of them right now. Mega Altaria, I compare it all the time to like Circle Circuit Pikachu back in the Genetic Apex days. Very, very consistent, has some matchups that it struggles with inherently, but is always going to get to the board state it wants to get to. The other decks at the top of the metagame are more, high roll decks. They're more like explosive decks. Mega Altaria doesn't have the same sort of, like oomph to it. It doesn't have the same power, but it is extremely consistent and it's always going to do what it wants to do. So I really like it. Still really strong going second. We have Chingling, Sableye for Oricorio, Jirachi to snipe the bench, and Indeedee EX to heal. Like the deck kind of does everything. Just a really, really good deck overall. To me, definitely a top 3 deck in the metagame right now. Also 53% win rate. Next up is Hydreigon. Yeah, I think that Hydreigon has kind of taken that spot. It's definitely the best way to play Absol. However, this deck list really isn't built around Absol. I think that, playing Chingling, playing Copycat, and playing Hydreigon is enough there to kind of win the games. Hydreigon also has that explosive potential. Chingling here in the active spot is just a free retreat pivot, and it's also just a Pokemon that stops your opponent from rare candying, and I think that's valuable enough. We are playing one Zweilous in the deck because Chingling is prominent in the metagame, but the whole idea with Hydreigon is that realistically, this thing can attack on your second turn for 130 damage. So it has that high roll potential. And if that does happen, it's honestly really hard to win this matchup just because it's so much damage. And then of course we have Absol on the back line, which can finish games really effectively. Not a Pokemon we really want to lead with, maybe unless we're going second into some specific matchups, but one Mega Absol seems correct. So to me, again, we've been talking about Absol so much this season. Mega Absol's a really good card. In some specific ways, but really bad in other ways. You know what I mean? So I think that really the only times Absol has really shined this season is when Oricorio has really carried it through most of the game, or Hydreigon is carrying it. And right now, I think that the Hydreigon Chingling combination is by far the best way to play Mega Absol. From a win rate perspective this entire week, it's been definitely at the forefront of the metagame and has had definitely a very, very high win rate. It's sitting around 51.5, so not as high of an overall win rate as the other 3 decks that we've mentioned. That's why I have it 4th here on the list. But again, definitely just a strong deck list. You know what I mean? So I'm going to be doing 50-50 into Suicune Greninja, about 50-50 into Decidueye. It is struggling into Altaria, does really well into Magnezone, struggles a little bit into Blaziken Heatmor, but does pretty decent across the board in all of the other matchups, which is kind of why I like the deck list. And theoretically, like Chingling, Hydreigon, like you're going to do well into base. You're going to have the opportunity to beat any deck in the entire game. Again, this is a bit more of a high roll strategy, so its overall win rates are going to be a little bit lower, but it's very explosive, very powerful on the high end, right? Because that ability to go turn 2 Hydreigon for 130 is absolutely insane, whether you're going first or second, which is important to note. This is actually a deck that kind of likes to go first, which is unique in the metagame. So I would kind of put this like just one notch below right now, at least going into this weekend, below the other 3 decks that we've mentioned, but still a very, very strong deck list, and its win rates and its performances this week compared to the Oricorio Absol deck has been way better and much, much higher. So that's one reason here why I wanted to include Hydreigon in this video. I don't have too much else to say about it. We all kind of understand what this deck list does, and I definitely think it's got to be mentioned in today's video, so that's why we're mentioning it. And next up is Decidueye. I mean, yeah, it's still Decidueye, and I think that Decidueye is, again, totally fine in the metagame. I do think it's like a kind of a notch below some of the other decks, but it is operating at a 52% win rate overall this season. Really, really good into Absol and Oricorio. Really good into Suicune. Those are kind of the 2 matchups that it really does extremely well into. Everything else is like a little bit lackluster, 50-50 into Hydreigon. It struggles a lot into Altaria, struggles into Magnezone, and definitely also struggles into, Blaziken. So the matchup spread's a little bit more viable, but against certain things, this deck list has an absolutely incredible win rate, and I think that it's one of the better sort of counter meta decks in the metagame right now. Again, I wouldn't really consider Decidueye to be like a meta driving deck, but its matchups into things, like Absol into Suicune Greninja are just so strong that I think it really kind of carries its win rate, and carries its worth in terms of why you should be playing Decidueye. So again, I think that the metagame's becoming a little bit more condensed. After those initial 4 decks that we talked about today, right now in this video, the next 4 decks that we're going to talk about are a little bit more specific in terms of counter meta. And there's so many different options sort of in this tier, but I would definitely put everything from now on until the end of the video like a little bit below in terms of it's solidified sort of meta viability, or like from a tier list perspective. You know what I mean? So like the decks that we talked about at the beginning of this video, those are like S tier. Everything else in here is sort of like an A tier deck. But again, a lot of these sort of A tier viability decks can absolutely mop some of the S tier decks. It's from an overall perspective. I know some people get confused about that. It's like, why do these S tier decks lose to the A tier decks? It's like, well, it's just, that's just how it works. Like, you know what I mean? These decks are A tier because they beat an S tier deck. You know, they just lose to other things. So Decidueye is kind of in that tier here. And I think that we've kind of figured out how to play Decidueye. Again, this is a deck list that can kind of struggle to draw the right cards, but May and Copycat have done absolute wonders to Decidueye in terms of making it more consistent. We can play double Dartrix, double of the Sniping Arrow Decidueyes, and we no longer really struggle into Oricorio at all. All that matters is that we get our Pokemon online. Some people have mentioned playing like one Celestic Town Elder in this deck. I think it's a little bit niche. I would rather just play like May and Copycat. And again, some things are just non-negotiable, like Research, like Rare Candy, like Leaf Cape. And again, this deck plays one Pokeball, which to me, I guess is fine, but it is a little bit scary because like you will lose games if you don't find your second Rowlet. And I know the space is limited here, but honestly, if I were to play this deck, I might cut one Erica for a Pokeball, even though of course you don't need to Pokeball. I just hate not having the second Rowlet. But anyway, I'm not saying that's better. That's just sort of my opinion. I really like Decidueye, still a top choice right now. I think a very, very solid A tier choice. Next up is going to be the first inclusion of Oricorio. And this is kind of the only deck I think right now that plays Oricorio and Chingling, and I think it's better off for it. Magnezone, again, is a really interesting deck. It's something that, specifically does really well into a few matchups, but just, can't win other matchups. Like that's the weird thing about these deck lists is that they're just way more volatile and they're more specific in their matchup spreads, but Magnezone definitely still a top choice. Again, operating at a 52.5% win rate so far. So, I mean, it has been winning games. It's actually got about a 55% win rate into Absol Oricorio, a 56% win rate into Suicune, a 54% win rate into Decidueye, but a 7% win rate into Hydreigon. So it definitely struggles against Hydreigon a lot and is struggling a lot into Mega Blaziken at a 35% win rate. So again, really, really good into some matchups, really bad into others. Decks like this thrive off particular matchups in the metagame, and you never really know, what decks at the top of the tier list are going to change, which is going to change the viability of some of these decks lower down on the tier list. But for right now, some of the most prominent decks get beat very heavily by Magnezone and Oricorio, and I think that the one Chingling and Copycat, like this is another thing, just like Decidueye, Copycat has really exploded Magnezone's viability just because it's so much more consistent that we get the Pokemon we need to with those 2 copies of Copycat as well as 2 copies of Research. So everything about this deck I like. This is Oricorio with Pokemon Center Lady and Double Giant Cape, so you're going to have to get through that in your own right. Magnezone, once it does get set up, is a really difficult Pokemon to deal with, especially with Giant Cape. It's going to live attacks and then 2-hit KO mostly everything. So that's the big upside to Magnezone, a really, really strong Pokemon, purely single prize archetype, and Oricorio fits in here very, very well. So nothing else to really say about it. Just a really specific sort of counter meta deck list that I think, just like Decidueye has a lot of reason to play it. If Magnezone or Decidueye were to win this weekend, I would not be surprised because it really just comes down to what decks and what matchups they hit for the players that play this deck when they get into day 2. You know what I mean? A lot of people get confused about that. We took a look at, like on the channel, what I oftentimes do is take a look at like the overall win rates and then the specific win rates against decks that are like on the rise in play rate. And that's kind of how I calculate which decks are worth playing. But what most players do is just take a look at like the top of the standings and they'll be like, oh, this deck won this week, this must be the best deck. It doesn't really always work like that. A lot of times in day 2, because it's just a single elimination bracket, it's a lot about variance and luck in terms of which matchups that, a particular deck faces on its way to winning the tournament. You know what I mean? Like there's so much variability in terms of that. I think that looking at like average win rates and specific win rates and meta share, fluctuations is really the way to determine the viability of decks. So I don't expect everybody to fully understand that or, I guess do all of that work, but that's why I do that work and then I show it to you guys on the channel. So there you go. Magnezone, definitely worth playing. The next two decks here, you're going to find them familiar because I actually talked about them on yesterday's video. So if you haven't seen that video, these are two deck lists that I would we're going to have like 2 wild cards this week. That's what we're going to do. We have like we have like 6 decks. We have 4 top meta decks, 2 counter meta decks, and then I actually have like 2 kind of wild card decks at the end of this video. So these were both mentioned yesterday, but I wanted to mention them again because more people will probably watch this video than yesterday's video. And I think that these decks have a lot of potential. So kind of double wild cards for me this week. Comment down below what you guys think of that. Anyway, next up is going to be this Indeedee Giratina Oricorio deck. This got first place at a tournament this week, and I really haven't seen it kind of pop off. Like, I think that the Absol version of Oricorio has dropped off pretty heavily, and I think that's just because the way people are able to deal with that deck is much different now than it was before. However, this version of Oricorio was kind of set up in position to be an Oricorio deck that really can deal with some of those decks that traditionally can kind of counter Oricorio. The whole idea here is to use Oricorio to kind of stall the game and then set up Indeedee and Giratina to basically 2-hit KO like a mega Pokemon. Like, that's kind of like the idea, right? We're keeping Oricorio alive with Giant Cape, with the PCL, and with the Indeedee EXs. It's really, really annoying to get through this 1 Oricorio or 2 Oricorios. And even if you do, you're going to be staring down a Giratina or an Indeedee EX, which are both really strong attackers on the back line, right? Plus a Giant Cape Giratina with 170 HP is hard to KO. And it's the same with Indeedee. Like, there's not a lot of things that deal 150 damage if you cape an Indeedee EX. So that's the whole idea with this deck. It's a slow, grindy deck. From a tournament perspective, you know, this deck might not pop off just because of, like, it might tie games. But I think it can deal enough damage and put enough pressure kind of in that mid to late game section of the game that it's actually just able to win a bunch of matchups. So again, there's not a lot of data on this deck, but the more I think about this list and the more I think about how it performs against a lot of the other top decks of the game, I think that this could be sort of the new top way to play Oricorio, and that's why it's a wild card. Definitely not a popular deck. We don't have a lot of data on it, but when I take a look at this deck list, I think to myself, wow, like, yeah, like this is something that many decks in the metagame right now just can't like effectively deal with very well. And I think that you know, definitely you know, adds a lot of value to a list like this. And like I said, it's a wild card pick. I wouldn't expect this to really pop off, but I leave the wild cards for the end of the video because I think that they have just a ton of potential in terms of, you know, winning games in the current metagame, right? They just haven't really caught on yet. That's what the wild card's really all about. So again, it's a really simple list. I mean, it's Indeedee, it's Giratina. Some people might be asking me like what energy types we play for this deck list. I honestly don't know. Because the one tournament where the player won, I don't really know exactly, like it didn't list what energy types for this deck was. So I guess that's not very helpful, but maybe he was swapping around energies depending on the matchup, whether Oricorio was useful or not as an attacking option. Who knows? You could play dual energies here very easily. That way you could attack with Oricorio and also set up Giratina and Indeedee. That makes the most sense to me, but maybe you just use Oricorio as a wall, but I don't really think that that's the best way to play it. So I think that you're probably playing lightning and psychic energies, which is also a kind of a unique combination here. That would be my guess, but I could be wrong about that. We just have really no way of knowing. Test it yourself and just sort of choose whichever one you prefer. But yeah, no, this is definitely a really, really strong deck that I would heavily recommend. So that's why it's sort of at the end of the video. Like I said, we have 2 wild cards. And next up is going to be the Poison Absol deck. So I know I just talked about how Oricorio Absol was definitely on the decline and that, you know, different decks playing Oricorio have kind of fit that niche a little bit better recently. But I do think that Absol is really strong. And every Absol deck that I've seen pairs it with Chingling to great success. And I think that this is a version here that's very similar to the Hydreigon Chingling Absol deck, but is more focused around Absol itself and not so much Hydreigon, which is again a bit of more of a high roll strategy. So this deck to me is like my favorite deck that not many people are playing. A lot of people in my Discord have been playing this deck and winning a lot with it and being really successful with it. And I absolutely love it. So the whole idea here is Poison Barb, Nihilego, chip damage with Chingling item lock, and then we can finish the game with Absol. So what's really cool with this deck is that we can commit basically all of our dark energies to Absol, unless maybe we're playing against Oricorio, and that way we can just use Nihilego to deal with Oricorio very easily. And it adds way more damage than you might think, right? We Poison Barb the Chingling, we go in, we item lock, we put double Nihilegos on our bench, and then all of a sudden Chingling's dealing 10 damage every attack, but also if it gets attacked, then your opponent takes like 30 damage with double Nihilego. And that's every turn. That damage definitely adds up, and it can really become a really, really big deal, especially because, of course, the damage for Mega Absol is so low. So that extra poison damage really does kind of set like a buffer for us to go into Absol and then actually take KOs because, you know, the poisoned Pokemon just can't really survive all of that poison damage plus the 80 damage from Absol. And since we don't really have many other Pokemon that we'd like to commit energies to, we can set up double Absol pretty easily in this deck list. It's a lot better than you might think. A really, really really annoying control deck, but one of the few ways that I've seen Absol really be able to perform as like the core of the deck list, which is why I really like it. Again, I don't think the Oricorio and Hydreigon versions of Absol are decks that have Absol like at the forefront. I think this is a deck that really does actually use Absol to great effect to take KOs, not just sort of come in at the end of the game and you know, and end things as like a high HP, you know, Pokemon that can live in attack and then discard a supporter card. So I really like it. Plus double Cyrus, so if they try to retreat to get out of poison, we bring them right back in. We can utilize double Pokemon Center Lady as well, which is absolutely hilarious. We have Red Card, we have Guzma, Copycat, and XP. This is probably like one of my favorite decks in the entire game. Again, not something that's really caught on recently. I have seen some people run like Chingling, Tyrogue with Mega Absol just as an option to get around Oricorio, but I think that this version of Absol, the Poison Nihilego Chingling version, is actually just the best way to play Absol. If you're not playing, of course, like Oricorio or Hydreigon, you know what I mean? Like if you're playing a real actual Mega Absol deck, to me, this is the #1 option right now, and I absolutely love it. So what's really cool about this deck is it does really well into Absol Oricorio and does really well into Hydreigon Absol, right? The combination of Nihilego, Poison, and Chingling just kind of beats the other Absol variants. And the player that played this deck to basically, I think, get top 4 at a recent tournament, beat a bunch of other top meta decks like Blaziken, like Suicune and stuff. So this is just a really, really strong deck list, and something that I would heavily recommend given the current state of the top of the metagame and the most played deck. So sort of our second wild card this week. We have double wild cards, but I think that both of these decks have a ton of merit, and I'm going to be pushing them on the channel because I think they deserve to see a lot more play. I think they could be really valuable contenders to the metagame. So yeah, there we go. Those are our top 8 decks right now going into this 3rd week of Pokemon Pocket Meta. Like I said, we have, what is it, like 13, less than 2 weeks until ranked season comes out. We will have 2 more Pocket Mats tournaments, I believe, until then. So you guys should definitely go play in the tournament series. It's a great way to like earn like actual, you know, money, but also compete against the best players in the world. So what we're seeing right now with this break of ranked battles really is sort of an opportunity for the best actual players to play in a competitive setting and really get all of the shine, right? I think that ranked battles definitely is the most popular way to play competitive Pokemon Pocket, and that's why we cover it on the channel. But if you're looking for like a true competitive experience, tournaments really are the way to go. Go ahead, go register for the Pocket Mats Pocket Tournament number 8, and you know, number 9 and number 10, which you're going to be following in subsequent weeks. Big shout out to the entire team of people that make this tournament happen. Shout out to all you guys. Comment down below what you guys think of the decks in this video. Just because something wasn't mentioned in today's video doesn't mean it's not good, but I wanted to limit it to like the top like 6 decks and then a couple of wildcard picks. That's kind of how I'm feeling it right now. The metagame definitely getting a little bit more condensed, but that doesn't mean things can't change completely like on a dime, which honestly they probably will. And I think the results of this weekend are definitely going to impact the metagame significantly. So stay tuned to the tournament and see what ends up winning. You know what I mean? Because that's like the biggest deal right now is what's winning these large 600, 700, 800 player tournaments, right? It's always a lot of fun, and we will be live Saturday and Sunday, so definitely tune in there for sure. But anyway, there it is, guys. There's the video. Comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, peace out.